Tonight we're going to talk about sardine carriers. But first, I really want to start by talking about the sardine industry. Some of you may know I'm uh, a writer. I've covered the coast since the early 1980s, first for the Bangor Daily, and then I started my own publication. And unfortunately, it was the end of the sardine industry era, the 80s and 90s, and some of the factories would continue, but uh, it was really starting to wane at that point. Uh, and back then, I actually started putting a computer program together, documenting all of the carriers that I knew of. And then it kind of got lost in the shuffle. And about 2 or 3 months ago, I started it up again. And what became definitely obvious is that I should have kept going back when I started it, either in the late 80s or early 90s, because unfortunately, a lot of the people that you needed to get the information from are gone. So getting back to the sardine industry, it really started because of the Franco-Prussian War. And the French were really, really big in the sardine industry, and they would actually export the sardines to the United States through New York. But during the war, they couldn't do that. So there were people in the United States that were looking for an alternative, and George Burnham made an effort to can sardines, which really are not sardines, they're herring. They're small herring, and you got to get them to uh, the factories quick because they spoil quick. But anyways, George Burnham tried, and I'm not sure if he's related to Burnham and Morrill, but he didn't make it. Griffin Brothers tried, and they didn't make it. But Julius Wolfe from New York came to Eastport in 1875, and he started and opened a factory, and he actually was successful. So mainly the primary businesses that were doing sardines in the 1870s, 1880s, they all centered around Passamaquoddy Bay, especially Eastport, Lubec, and the Canadian Maritimes. Uh, you know, how they caught sardines, they started with weirs, and I'm not sure how many of you have ever seen a weir. There's still some remnants of them up and down the coast, mostly in Eastport. They're stakes driven into the ground, into the water. They're done in a circle so that basically the fish comes in following the coast and gets trapped inside the circle. And then what you do is you go in and you would net them out with basically hand nets and carry them to market. Uh, then later on, and the first to do that was the Native Americans. Later on, they would actually shut off coves. The heron would go into a cove, and the boats would wait. And as soon as they figured that most of the heron were inside, they'd run a netting across the cove mouth and shut it off. And then came the seiners, and we can argue about, whether the seiners are actually the problem, that there are limited herring on the coast now or not. But the seiners became a big thing in the early 1900s. Uh, like I said, herring is small, but they also pack larger herring, and they call them heron steaks. There's probably other terms for them too. So when they come to market, their heads and tails are cut off. They're packed in cotton or olive oil. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever used raised mustard, but originally that was actually used uh, to pack sardines in, because after a couple of days, oil isn't really good because um, the fish has started to do has its own taste and odor, so they use mustard to kind of cover it up. Families in these towns like Eastport, Lubec, Robbinston, all the way down the coast, all the way to Portland. but mostly up in Eastport, the family would actually be employed by the company, uh, wives, daughters, and even the small boys would work in the factories, uh, and they would be housed by the company. They'd shop in the company store. So basically, the company kind of owned them. These companies would also pack other things and not just sardines. They would pack mutton, especially if you're trying to keep the factory open year round. Now, in 1882, Eastport had 18 factories. Lubec had four, Robinson one. In 1886, there were 32 canneries in the United States. In 1900, Maine had 79. Now here comes the drop. 1986, there were five companies and only nine factories left. And I don't remember, Stinson was the last, and that is in Port Prospect Harbor, up by Winter Harbor. They were the last factory to close. And I would believe that they were between 10 and 15 years ago that that factory closed. And that was the end of the sardine industry in the United States. Now, Canada had a number of factories, Deer Isle, Grand Manan, over and up and down the New Brunswick coast and probably into Nova Scotia. The biggest one was, of course, Connor Brothers. That's where Stinson's machinery went, was Connor's Brothers in Black's Harbor. They started in 1885. In 1900, they had five factories in Charlotte County, New Brunswick. But by 1957, there was only one factory left. So one of the biggest factories that we had was the North Lubeck Manufacturing and Canning Company. That operated for 99 years. They went from 1884 to 1983. Then in 1899, a group of Chicago investors got involved and they purchased about 70% of the factories on the coast of Maine, trying to actually, take over the industry and have control. But Julius Wolfe also formed a company called Standard Sardine Company, and they were competition. And the competition was so tight that neither of them could actually make enough money to continue. So they combined into Seacoast Canning Company. And that went until 1929. And then that broke apart and became R.J. Peacock and Seaboard Packing, which was controlled by the Pikes of Lubec. Now, the biggest boom in the sardine world came in World War One, which is obvious. Uh, and that's because in combat or, in those theaters, you needed an article of food that you could can and it would last, for a long, long time. Unfortunately, after the war, the boom didn't last. And, of course, they had built new plants, they employed a lot of people, and all of these people were, unfortunately unemployed. Now, the same thing happened in World War II. Now, I knew a great story. Somebody who tried to get out of the sardine business joined the military in World War II, and when he landed in Europe, his first job was to unload sardines off off a supply vessel at Normandy. So he really never got away from sardines. Uh, Unfortunately, like anything, the fish are unpredictable, and that causes a big, big problem in this world, the sardine world, and that forced many of the factories to go out of business. Now, like I said, a lot of these businesses were up and down the coast. Uh, there were plants, like I said, in Eastport, Lubec, Robinson. You come down, Jonesport had plants. Uh, I believe Gouldsboro had a plant. Uh, Southwest Harbor had one. I remember that one. It's now where Dysart's Marina is. Then there was one. Well, Brooklyn Boatyard was a sardine factory. Then you go over to Belfast, down to Rockland. There was some even further. I think New Harbor had one. Uh, Bass Harbor had one because that was an Underwood factory. which was converted into condominiums, and then all the way down to Portland. But there was never anything further than that. So, as I said, you really wanted to get the fish to market, and you wanted to get the fish to market quick. So, what they started with was small sailing vessels, and some of these were pinkies. Unfortunately, they're not very well documented. Um, I do know of some of the boats that started uh, being carriers, uh, but I'm sure we're missing quite a few of them because just no record of them exist. As time went on, they needed bigger and faster boats. And also, the early boats were all sail. Engines started coming in around 1900, started with gasoline, naphtha, then it went to crude oil or diesel, and the engines got more powerful, just like in any boat. Lobster boats are the same thing. They started with one lungers, and now they're up to almost 1700 horsepower. Fortunately, the sardine carriers never went that far. I don't think they put in much over three or 400 horsepower in most of these things. Uh, Deer Island, not Deer Isle, Deer Island. A lot of the people who worked on these vessels, especially in the Passamaquoddy area, Rockland, Portland, a lot of them were Deer Island people. They also built a lot of vessels on the island. It was interesting to me to see how much Deer Island had to contribute to the early history and actually right up through into the 1990s. Uh, John Gilman wrote a book called Master Masters, and if you haven't read it, it's probably one of the best books on the sardine carriers. You want to know about the sardine factories. He also did two books called Canned, and one is on the American factories and the other's on the Canadian factories. And he did a very, very nice job documenting what he could find out uh, about the sardine industry and the boats that served it. Now, Eastport had been known as the capital of the sardine industry. There are and in the 1980s, they were all gone. And I remember somewhere that there was a fire on in Eastport that claimed most of the factories except one or two. And I believe it burned almost 20 factories. And I haven't found the reference again. Uh, but there's also references to 13 other fires over the years that the canneries were running that actually burned the factory down. And most of them, fortunately, were rebuilt. Players in the game, you could start with the Holmeses, the Lawrences, the Peacocks, the Pikes, the Stinsons, Warren, and Wilson. And as I said, the locations, they went anywhere from Eastport all the way down to Portland. Now, one of the interesting things, because I used John Gilman's book uh, for a lot of it, was a company called the Canadian Sardine Company. They had 9 carriers. They were 50 footers, and they had three others that were 80 footers. Now, one of these was the Casarco, which is basically an abbreviation of the name. So you could take the first part of Canadian, the first part of Sardine, and the first part of Company, and they built 13 boats. So it went from 1 to 14 because they wouldn't use 13. Now, the first one, number one, had a very interesting story because the boat went across from Canada and came into Eastport. Well, unfortunately, they had illegal aliens on board. They were Norwegians, and the captain was going to get arrested and put into jail. So he decided to untie the vessel and head back to Canada. And he was never allowed, and either was the vessel, the Casarco number one, was never allowed back into the United States, uh, which was kind of interesting. Now, numbers 6 and 7 were built by an N.M. Frost from Digby, Nova Scotia. Now, what's interesting about that is also, you wonder, because that's where Will Frost, who is claimed to be the father of the Maine lobster boat, he came from. So I don't know if he's a relative, but I would bet that he probably is. Uh, they also had like a lot of sardine factories early on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they had a boat called the Mildred McCall. She was built by the Adams Company in East Boothbay in 1912, and she was auxiliary powered, but what she was used for was as a tug. The sailing vessels sometimes couldn't get to the factory because there was no wind. So she would go out and tie on to all as many vessels as many of the sailboats as she could, and she'd tow them into port so they could get to the factories. She ended up being burned. Uh, the Canadian company should never have gone out of business, but they invested so much money in her startup that they never could get really off the ground. And in 1918, they were sold to the Booth Sardine Company. And in 1987, all the buildings that were associated with them were gone. One of the other interesting boats that was up in Canada, and it's interesting because in the United States, you have a problem with what's known as the Jones Act. And we can't use a foreign vessel to move uh, uh, freight from one port to another in the United States. It has to be an American vessel. And the Black Diamond was built, and she was the first boat that was built for the Booth Company. Of course, that was related to the Canadian Sardine Company because that was after they had bought her. And she was built by Charles Ingalls of East Machias. He built a number of vessels, and we're going to go over one of them a little later. And she was built in 1918. She was 64 feet long and had a 60 horsepower Fairbanks Morse. And she was being used as a fish dragger later in life. And in 1983, she was off Cash's Ledge and started on fire and sank out there. Now, the Sardine Carriers had numerous builders. Now, the Canadian builders, W.C. Mackay from Shelburne, H.W. Embry and Sons from Port Hawkesbury, John McLean, Mahone Bay, J.H. Benson, Bear River, the Boudreau brothers from Comeauville, William Saboyer, he was from Lunenburg, Solomon Morish was from Lunenburg, Arthur Oxner, also from Lunenburg. This guy really built a lot of the vessels in Canada, and that is George Everett Richardson from Deer Island. And I think he came from because Deer Island is broken up into all kinds of little hamlets, I guess you'd want to call it. So he comes from Richardsonville. And there's Lord's Cove and all kinds of things up there that you really don't see on a map. So I think they're more of a naming that they actually use instead of us. Now, he actually moved to Lubec and would build some of the vessels there. Cecil Tewksbury, he was from Leonardville. That's also on Deer Island. George Rigby, he was from St. Andrews. J.B. Outhouse, he was from Tiverton, which is also on Digby. Wagstaff and Hatfield, Point Greville, and the Connors brothers, they had their own boat shop in Black's Harbor, and they built a lot. And if they didn't build them, they did an awful lot of repairing. Here in the United States, I mentioned Adams already. He was from East Boothbay. I mentioned Charles Ingalls from East Machias. Riley and Adrian Beale. Riley built 4 carriers, and actually one started her life as a smack, and that was the Arthur S. Woodard. Um, but Riley was an interesting character. He was one of the only people on Beale's Island that could actually draw lines for a vessel. Most everybody on Beale's or Jonesport, they used a half hull, and then they would take the lines off a half hull and loft them out to build the boat. And Adrian probably could also do um, line drawings. They learned that during World War II because they actually were at Billings Diesel and Marine that were building government contracts, and that's how they learned how to, design on paper. Rice Brothers from East Boothbay, Hodgson Brothers from East Boothbay, one of the best known carrier builders, Newbert and Wallace of Thomaston, Herbert Colson built in Eastport, Southwest Boat Corporation in Southwest Harbor, they built a lot. George Lawley built a couple of boats in East Boston, Lash Brothers in Friendship, and the Gamage Shipyard in South Bristol built sardine carriers. Now, one of the earliest sardine carriers, and probably most of you have seen this vessel one time or another, and that's the Lewis R. French. She was built in South Bristol in 1871, and she's rigged as a schooner. She's 55 feet by 18 6 inches, and she carried sardines in Passamaquoddy Bay until basically the sailing industry uh, was gone. I'm sure she had been powered at that time, but her days as that ended because she was a slower boat, couldn't carry as many. Uh, they measured the cargo in hogshead, and a hogshead is about 63 gallons or 1,240 pounds. I've also seen it listed as how many bushels, but I couldn't find where I found that documentation. Now, later on, of course, the Lewis R. French became one of the schooners of the Windjammer fleet. She had been bought by John Foss. Uh, John came to Rockland, and that was the first boat that he actually totally rebuilt and put it into the Windjammer trade in Rockland and sailed it for a number of years before he bought the American Eagle and rebuilt her in the late 80s. Now, a very, very interesting character, and unfortunately, we don't know much about this guy, and it's Morris Dow of Roke's Bluff. He built 6 carriers in 1903, 1904, and it was interesting because all of a sudden, because I've done a great big database, 148,000 ships at this time are up online, and I ran across these and had no idea what they really were, because the early merchant vessel list doesn't tell you what their occupation is. After I think it's 1907, they actually will tell you if they're a freighter, but sometimes that doesn't tell you if they're carrying sardines or they're carrying just regular freight from port to port. But he built 6 vessels, and they were all built for the Seacoast Canning Company, and they were based out of New Jersey. And supposedly they had 57 factories from Eastport to Jonesport, which I don't think that that's true. That's an awful lot of factories between Eastport and Jonesport. They actually had 4,400 employees and 50 carriers, and their brand was called the Continental. They could pack 800,000 cases per year. In 1926, they were taken over by the Peacock and Pikes, and in 1929, this company was split to R.J. Peacock and Seaboard Packing Company. And of course, 1929 was the year of the Great Crash. So you wonder if the crash had anything to do with it, and whether they could actually still market sardines. Was it a cheap food? Uh, and that would allow them to stay, at least somewhat solvent, so long as they could get the fish, which I said was a real problem. Now, these were all auxiliary sail, so they had power. They were 60 feet long, 13 feet wide, and they carried 40 hogsheads. The thing was, they were low-sided, they were narrow, they sailed really well, but if they were empty, they rolled horribly. And a lot of these vessels have that same description of their sailing characteristics. If they were loaded, they actually sailed well, either under sail or under power, but if they were empty, they were a bear to handle. Now, here we go with the first photograph we've got. This is the Savannah W. Beale. Now, she was built in East Booth Bay in 1911 for Charles Henry Beale of Beale's Island. She started her life as a bank schooner, then ended up as a smack. Now, I'm not sure if she was a dry smack or a wet smack. Now, the difference is a wet smack has all kinds of holes drilled in the hull, and of course, there's bulkheads on either side of where they've drilled holes in the hulls to allow water to come in and keep circulation so that the lobsters, because that's what you're usually carrying in a smack is lobsters, and they would run all the way from Canada, Nova Scotia, all the way down to either Boston or New York to market. And then she became a carrier. So if she was a wet well smack, they filled all the holes. And that's been done numerous times. Now she was 77, no, 71 feet 7 inches long, and was 17 2 inches wide. She could carry 77 hogsheads. She had auxiliary gas, but when she was actually first uh, built, she had no wheelhouse. The wheelhouse was added in the 1920s when she was being rebuilt, and they also changed her engine to a straight eight cylinder Chrysler gas engine. Now, later she was rebuilt in the 50s and repowered with 671s, which was a GM motor. There's jokes about that because the only thing you're worried about is how much oil you were putting out of the engine because 671s were notorious for throwing oil everywhere. Uh, when Peacock closed, she was taken to Southwest Harbor and put up for sale. And John Worth, I'm not sure many of you know who John is. John worked a lot in the windjammer trade, and this is why he bought her. And he sailed her out of Portland. He also was a professor at Maine Maritime Academy, and he also has done captaining of some of the ferries on Penobscot Bay. So he sailed her out of Portland. Then he sold her, and she's gone through various owners over the years. Uh, at one time, she was sailing out of Greenport, New York. Then she went to Mystic Seaport, and I'm not sure that they handled her very well or whether, because it's a big mouth to feed if you're going to sit here and try to fix a vessel of this size. Now, remember that 71 feet overall is probably not her true length overall. That's probably between the perpendiculars. So she's probably another 10 feet beyond that. And then she came back to Eastport, and I'm not sure how many of you remember when the dock let go and collapsed. Well, she was one of the vessels damaged. So she was taken, I think, to Hinckley Company, even though Hinckley didn't do the work. And they had to repair her side where the dock had come down on top of her. Unfortunately, she never got totally repaired the way she should have. She should have been totally rebuilt. About, I'd say 5 years ago, she made a trip from, I believe, Southwest Harbor to Gloucester. And when she arrived, I got photographs of her up on the railway at Gloucester Maritime, which is right in the center of town, and she was pretty well racked. You could, there were places in the hull that were actually you could put your hand through. So it was a little iffy trip, I would believe. And that was done by Harold Burnham, who's a well-known boat builder in Essex. His family were longtime boat builders, and Harold's carried on the tradition. And he was going to rebuild the vessel. Well, unfortunately, I think she's gone because Harold found out that the Coast Guard would not allow him to use her for carrying passengers because of her dimensions and not having enough space down below decks for the Coast Guard's regulations. So, unfortunately, I believe she's gone. This one is Grayling. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know Rice Brothers. That was, or today, if you go down to East Boothbay, that's where Washburn and Dowdy now builds. That's where they build those great big tugboats. She was built in 1915 for Seacoast Canning, and she was the first true powered carrier that was built. And she was 59 feet by 12 feet 6 inches, and she carried 52 hogsheads. Her nickname was the Shingle, long and narrow. Again, sailed well, but she rolled. Now, in 1991, had just started Maine Coastal News 3 years before this, and I ran across her at Benjamin River Marine, which was being run by Doug Hyland, and Todd Skoog was one of the guys that was on board and really did, the two of them really rebuilt this boat into a yacht. And if you go to the Eggemoggin Reach Regatta, or and sometimes I believe she is housed at Mystic in the winter. They give them winter berths. Uh, she's a beautiful yacht, and they maintain her in impeccable condition. And if you can look at this picture, she's what I would term a double ender. Now, some of them are not what I would term a double ender. They're more what we used to call a pod stern, which is they're a little wider. They come in a little sharper at the stern, and you'll see that in a couple of the carriers that we're going to cover in a little while. But she's a very nice boat. But like a lot of these, they're hard to make into a yacht because they're so big. And it's very hard to handle a boat that's 60 to 70 feet long. And some of the bigger ones were up to 84. So the next one is Medrick. Now, I remember Medrick when she was in Eastport at the last of her life. She was built by Hodgson Brothers in East Boothbay. Hodgson was well known for building all kinds of vessels. They started in 1816 and they built schooners, they built powerboats, they built yachts, and mostly at the time that this boat was built, they were building yachts for a number of the big yacht designers. Some of them Alden, some of them Hand. So she was built for Seacoast again. She was 61 feet, and she was turned a double ender. Uh, but you look at that stern, and that's more to me as a pod stern. Uh, but I guess it's one half a dozen of the other. Uh, she carried 52 hogshead and she was powered by a 45 horsepower engine. Now, Peacocks took her over in 1929 and ran her until the 1990s. And that's when I remember her was she was sitting at the dock in Eastport, uh, and she just sat there. And then finally, she got hauled up at Moose Island Marine, and she sat in the lot, and you could tell that there was nobody going to come to save her because she was going to be, you better have a big bank account for a boat that size, because it was going to cost you $1 million or $2 million to actually rebuild a vessel of this size. And she ended her days there at Moose Island Marine. And that was probably in the early 2000s. The next one, this is Double Eagle. And again, it was another vessel I ran into in the 1990s, almost the same time I ran into Medrick. She was built by Charles Ingalls of East Machias in 1929 for the North Lubeck Manufacturing and Canning Company. And she started life as a carrier and a freight boat. Now, a lot of times the canneries, they needed supplies. So if the carrier didn't have any work that day and they needed supplies from somewhere, they'd send the carrier to go get them and bring it to them. Uh, she was rebuilt in 1949 in Nova Scotia, and at that point they lengthened her to 70 feet, and her square stern became a rounded stern, so more like what you would see in a tugboat or a steam vessel. And she ran out of things to do in the sardine world, and she was sold to Dale Prentice in New Harbor, and he used her for porgy fishing as a seiner and a bait boat. And he sold her in 1990 to Glenn Lawrence. I believe he lived in Elliott at the time, and he brought her to North End Shipyard, which is on the upper side of the Rockland Harbor, and they rebuilt her there. Uh, I believe she was there almost 2 years, and they really went through her, and she was in very good condition. And Glenn kept her up in that kind of condition right up through till a couple of 3 years ago, when the sardine world, basically these boats were pushed out because of the government. Government made rules that uh, wouldn't allow these boats to continue on. Uh, the last time I saw her was this fall when I was at basically a show for people who have chandleries. Uh, and so I was there at one of the casinos. That's where they hold the show. And she was tied up at Mystic Seaport. And I'm not sure she's part of Mystic Seaport or whether that was just her berth for the winter. She looked like she needed a little bit of work. uh, and if they don't take care of it, they're going to need to do a lot of work because if you don't keep up with these boats, they become a real, real, real big problem quickly. This is Pauline, probably one of the prettiest boats. This was a design that came out of Newbert and Wallace in the late 40s. She was built by them in 1948 for the North Lubeck Manufacturing and Canning Company. Uh, she was 83 feet long and she would carry 118 hogsheads. Now, she ran out of Rockland for a number of years, but when that plant closed in 1983, uh, she kind of ended up out of business. For a little while, she carried bait around to the islands. In 1987, she was sold to, oh, what's their names? They owned a schooner in Camden, and they had Joel White uh, design her as kind of like a steamer, but it really wasn't a steamer that we would recognize that plied this coast. Uh, and so a lot of people didn't like the design. She operated kind of as a tour boat, overnight boat, and sometimes even they'd go for 4 or 5 to 7 days, kind of like the Windjammers, but just power. And she did that for a number of years, probably, 6 or 7. And then she ended up being sold, and she was at Billings Diesel and Marine for a number of years, sitting there. And finally, somebody in Blue Hill bought her. He put some money into it, but now that's a pod stern. And you can see how it's a lot different than the sharp stern of what you would call a double ender. She sat at Billings and Diesel Marine again for a number of years until about 5 years ago. They hauled her out on the railway. She's still there. And they repaired her bow and stern. Unfortunately, I don't think the stern was completed when the money ran out. But they also discovered that the work that they had done previously, like 10 years, 15 years before, the wood wasn't that good. And so it was another big, big problem. And it's estimated that it's going to cost about $1 million to repair this vessel. And unfortunately, I don't think her future looks very good. She's owned by Buzz Scott out of Booth Bay Harbor, and he told me that he didn't think her future looked good. Um, so he wanted to use her to. He goes and tries to do some finding of ghost traps, which are lobster traps that have no lines attached to them anymore. So they're still fishing, not really because they have escape hatches and stuff, but he goes and tries to get them out of the water. And he thought it would be nice to take kids out with her to do that kind of work. But if the money doesn't come in, she's probably going to unfortunately get cut up. The next one is the Jacob Pike. She's another one. She's a sister to the Pauline. Her real sister is Marianne. It's an interesting. That looks like Gamage's shipyard because that's a big steel. Unless it's the Snow shipyard in Rockland. It could be Snow shipyard in Rockland because there's not very many places that deal with big steel draggers. So she was built by Newbert and Wallace in Thomaston in 1949 for the Holmes Packing Company. 72 feet by 17 feet, and she carried 83 hogshead. She was later lengthened to 83 feet and carried 94 hogsheads. Now, she was one of the first they tried this, and they did this in regular schooners and ships and uh, the old sailing vessels. They put salt between her timbers. And the reason you do that is to try to eliminate fresh water getting down inside because fresh water is a killer, and that's what's going to start dry rot. So they figured that if they loaded between the frames with salt, that it would be okay, and she wouldn't rot as fast. But the common complaint was that the forecastle was always cold and damp. But I'm not sure that the salt had anything to do with that. She ran out of Rockland for a number of years. There's a lot of pictures of her in Rockland. Here she is hauled out and getting a paint job. That looks like she's at Billings Diesel and Marine because that looks like the railway that the Pauline is on right now. And then this is an interesting one. She was run one time. She was run by the Lords. So Sherman, Alfred, and Lawrence Lord were her captains at one point or another. And when they were the her masters, she was called the House of Lords. She ran for Portland Clyde Fisheries and Stonington Packing until there was no more sardines to haul. Then she went down to Winter Harbor. Dana Rice owned her, who unfortunately just passed away. Then it went to Taylor Allen. Then it came to the Penobscot Marine Museum. Then it went to J.J. Lobster in Rockland, and he used it as a bait boat for a number of years. Then she went to Booth Bay, and then the guy got there was nothing again, like I told you, that the regulations had basically eliminated the use of these boats. And so somebody bought it in Booth Bay, and he got sick and sold it to somebody in Cundy's Harbor. And 2 winters ago, she sank. And last winter, she sank in that storm in Cundy's Harbor, but not in Cundy's Harbor proper. It's up above Cundy's Harbor, but still in the Cundy's Harbor area. And she went to the bottom in not much water. The Coast Guard didn't like it because she had oil on board, but not that much. So they brought in Determination Marine and they raised her, uh, towed her to Portland, and then the Coast Guard and one of the Pikes was is actually Sumner Rue. He's a student at well, was a student at Kings Point Maritime in New York. He was trying to save the vessel, but unfortunately the Coast Guard wouldn't let him have it, and they uh, crushed her and put her in a dumpster. But they did allow him to take quite a bit of the material and items off of her because his hope is that he can build a replica of her to preserve the legacy because he is a Pike. Now, here's one, the William Underwood. Now, here's a problem. We'll show you what the problem is. She was built in 1924 for the William Underwood Company in East Booth Bay. She's 60 feet by 15 feet. She carried 50 to 60 hogsheads, and she was sold to Stinson's, who changed her name to the Marion H. She did winter shrimping because a lot of these boats, once the sardine industry kind of dwindled, these boats were kind of sent out and they did shrimping, they did fish dragging, they became scallop draggers, they did anything that, thought that they could make money with. And but the thing about this is which one is which? Because there's two with the exact same name. The second one I believe is the second one. The first photograph, I believe, is the first one. And the second one was built in Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1941 and is an Eldridge McGinnis design. And it was also built for the William Underwood Company. And she's 65 feet by 15.6. And she mostly ran out of Jonesport, but she later was sold. Now, I ran into her when, what was his name? He owned Atlantic Boat, uh, and he had amusement park, and he saw the grayling being redone. So he bought this boat, brought it over to where Fly Point Marine was, and started rebuilding it. And Todd Skoog was one of them that came in to work on the project. And I th believe he died in the middle of the project, and she sat for a number of years. And then Taylor Allen at Rockport Marine got the brilliant idea that he'd love to own it, and he did. He bought it, brought it over to Rockport Marine, and it sat in the way back of this shop, and they slowly picked away at it. And I believe it was 10 years later, he was able to launch her, full-fledged yacht, beautifully done, well appointed, and that just sold. He had had it on the market for a couple of years, and that just recently sold to somebody who's going to continue it as a yacht. So now I've been told not to go over too far. I'm already 3 minutes over, but I'm just going to quickly do this. Uh, the references I used was Masters for John Gilman, some of the stuff that I had written previously, but a lot more needs to be done to get all of the documentation of these boats together. So I've got to go through, or somebody's got to go through, is the Atlantic Fisherman, which the Penobscot Marine Museum has the whole run of, and that's from 1921 up. Then the Maine Coast Fisherman, National Fisherman, and one that I love using is the old Maine Industrial Journal. The other sources are going to be in the newspapers. But there's still a lot of work to do to get these well documented, but hopefully we can get it done within the next several years. That's it.